The silence of twins. I worked in the Westbrook house for 15 years. I watched a young couple move into the mansion with their dreams intact. I saw Caroline hang photographs on the walls, transforming cold rooms into a home. I witnessed her belly grow with twins inside. I remembered David carrying her up the stairs during those final months, afraid she might stumble. I held newborn Oliver and Ethan in their first minutes of life, while doctors stitched the incision on their mother's abdomen. Two tiny humans who gripped my fingers with such force, as if they already knew the world was dangerous and they needed to hold on tight. Now they were 5 years old, and for 186 days, I had not heard their voices. My name is Eleanor Gray. I'm 68 years old, and I'm a housekeeper. But in this house, where death stole laughter, I became something else. A witness, a keeper of memories. The only person who still remembered how things used to be before that night. Before the February evening when David Westbrook drove his family home on an icy highway. Before the 18-wheeler lost control on a curve. Before the moment when Caroline turned around, saw the metal giant flying toward their car, and shielded her children with her body. David suffered a concussion and a broken rib. The boys emerged without a scratch because their mother saved them with her own flesh. Caroline died 40 minutes later in the emergency room, never regaining consciousness. From that moment on, Oliver and Ethan stopped making any sound. Doctors called it selective mutism, following acute psychological trauma. Child psychologists spoke of dissociation and protective mental reactions. Speech therapists shook their heads. Physically, the vocal cords were healthy. The problem was in the brain, not the throat. David Westbrook was one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut. His technology company was worth billions. He could buy the best specialists in the world. But he couldn't buy back his sons' voices, couldn't buy their smiles, couldn't buy forgiveness for surviving when their mother did not. I watched guilt devour him from the inside. I saw him stand at the nursery door at night, unable to enter. His hand would hover over the doorknob, trembling, then drop. He would turn and walk to his study, where he drank whiskey until dawn, staring into emptiness. A month after the funeral, he hired the first nanny, Mrs. Parker was a woman of about 50, with an impressive resume, 3 advanced degrees in child psychology, 20 years of experience with traumatized children. She arrived with a suitcase full of books and a rehabilitation plan. She lasted 11 days. I remember that evening. Mrs. Parker sat on the floor in the playroom with the boys, showing them animal cards and gently, patiently trying to get them to repeat sounds. Meow, woof woof, moo. Her voice was kind, professional. The twins sat motionless, like statues. They stared at the cards with empty eyes. Oliver held Ethan's hand. They always held hands after the accident, as if afraid that if they let go, they would lose each other too. David stood in the doorway. I was carrying fresh towels and saw his face. He watched the scene, a stranger trying to force his children to speak, and something inside him broke completely. He told her that was enough, quietly but firmly. Mrs. Parker tried to object, to explain that children need time, that progress doesn't come instantly. But David repeated she was fired, she should pack her things. The woman went pale. She tried to convince him that the children were beginning to respond, that one more week would surely bring a breakthrough. But David cut her off. They weren't responding. They were afraid. The nanny was trying to extract something that was no longer there. Then he turned and left. The next morning, Mrs. Parker left with a check for double the contracted amount. I saw tears in her eyes as she got into the taxi. After her came Miss Chen, young, energetic, with a degree in nonverbal communication. She brought colored chalk, modeling clay, musical instruments. She tried to reach them through creativity. After 2 weeks, David fired her too. Too noisy, he said. The children were frightened. Then there was Mrs. O'Brien, a strict Irish woman with 30 years of experience. She believed in discipline and structure. She established a minute-by-minute schedule: breakfast at 7 sharp, lessons at 8, walk at 10. The boys followed all instructions silently, mechanically, like little robots. After 19 days, her suitcases stood by the front door. David fired them all, every single one after another. And I understood why, although he never said it aloud. He was afraid the children would become attached to another woman entering their lives, that they would begin to trust, that they would open up. And then this woman would leave. The contract would end. She would find another job, get married, move to another state. And the boys would lose another person. They had already lost their mother. David couldn't let them go through that again. But he was also afraid of something else. Afraid of seeing how someone succeeded where he had failed. How a strange woman pulled his children from the darkness into which he had driven them with his guilt and detachment. Every nanny who showed success became a mirror of his own inadequacy as a father. So he found reasons: too soft, too strict, too loud, too quiet, too young, too old. He sabotaged every attempt to save his sons because salvation would mean admitting they needed someone else, not him. In 6 months, 7 nannies came and went. Local staffing agencies began refusing to cooperate. The Westbrook house's reputation became toxic. A rich widower with traumatized children who fires everyone after 2 weeks and pays huge severance packages to keep people quiet. Meanwhile, the boys retreated deeper into their silence. They ate silently, played silently, looked out windows silently. In the evenings, they climbed into one bed and lay embracing, staring at the ceiling. They became shadows in their own home, ghosts with a living father, and I didn't know how to stop it. I was just a housekeeper. I could maintain cleanliness in the house, but I couldn't clean pain from children's souls. Until Sophia arrived. It happened at the end of August, almost 7 months after the accident. The agency sent the resume of the last candidate who agreed to consider this position. The others, learning the address, refused. Sophia Morrison was 28 years old. High school education, no degrees in psychology or pedagogy. Nanny experience. 3 years, 1 family, impeccable references. Under marital status gets said widow. David invited her for an interview more out of inertia than hope. I was in the dining room when she entered. Sophia wasn't a beauty in the classical sense. Average height, thin, dark hair pulled into a simple bun. Jeans, white shirt, no makeup. But there was something about her that made me stop with a cloth in my hands and look closely. Her eyes, they held the same emptiness as David's eyes. The same darkness that had settled in this house after the accident. This woman knew what loss meant. Not secondhand, she knew it in her flesh. The interview lasted 20 minutes. David asked standard questions: experience, approach to childcare, willingness to work with traumatized children. Sophia answered briefly, without unnecessary words. When he asked why she wanted this job, she was silent for a long time. Then she said simply, because she understood what it was like when the world collapsed, and she understood that children didn't need fixing. They needed someone to just be there. David hired her on the spot. I saw how he looked at her. There was recognition in his gaze. He saw a kindred spirit in her, someone who was also fighting ghosts. Sophia started the next day. No suitcases of teaching materials, no rehabilitation plans. She came with a small backpack containing a change of clothes and a book. Just one book, a children's book, worn with a broken spine. I led her to the playroom where the boys sat on the floor with a construction set. They were building two absolutely identical towers, synchronously, without looking at each other, as if an invisible connection between them transmitted every movement. Sophia sat on the floor a few meters from them. She didn't approach closely, didn't speak immediately. She just sat. She took out her book and began reading, aloud, but not addressing the boys, reading for herself, as if they weren't there. It was a story about a little bear cub who got lost in the forest and was looking for the way home. I stood in the doorway observing. The twins continued building, but I noticed Oliver, the one on the right, turned his head slightly, just a bit, almost imperceptibly. He was listening. Sophia read in a calm, quiet voice, without theatricality, without attempts to entertain. She just read. She reached the middle of the chapter and closed the book. She placed it beside her. She stood and left the room without saying goodbye, without trying to attract attention. In the hallway, she quietly asked me where the kitchen was, whether she could make tea. I led her. We sat at the small table in the corner, where I usually had breakfast. Sophia wrapped her palms around the hot mug and looked out the window. I didn't ask anything. I sensed this woman would speak on her own when she was ready. After a few minutes, she began talking. She told me that a year ago she lost her son. The child was 3 years old. They were vacationing at a lake, at her parents' house. The boy was playing on the shore, and she turned away for a minute, just 1 minute, to answer a phone call. When she turned back, he was gone. They found him 20 minutes later. Too late. Her voice was even when she told this story. Too even. The voice of someone who had retold this story hundreds of times already. To doctors, police, psychologists, to herself at night. A voice drained of all emotion, because if you start feeling, you won't stop. Her husband couldn't cope. 4 months later, he left. He didn't abandon her, no. He just couldn't see her face anymore, because it reminded him of their son. Every time he looked at her, he saw that phone call, that minute of inattention that killed their child. The divorce was quiet, quick, almost a relief for both. Sophia spent 6 months in therapy, support groups for parents who lost children, antidepressants, sleepless nights, slow, painful return to a life that no longer had meaning. Then she saw the job posting. A family with twins who had experienced trauma. All agencies were refusing. High salary, but a warning. The father was difficult. The children didn't speak. Previous nannies didn't last. And she thought maybe this was her chance. not to fix the past, not to replace her son, but simply to be near children who knew what pain was, who understood that the world could break in one instant. Maybe she could help them, and helping them, she would heal herself. I listened to her story and felt my heart constrict. This girl, because at 28 she seemed like a child to me, came here not for money. She came for redemption, for the opportunity to save those she couldn't save then. And I prayed that David wouldn't fire her too quickly, that he would give her a chance, because this woman could either save these children or break completely trying. The first week passed quietly. Sophia came every morning, spent several hours with the boys, and left. She didn't try to make them speak, play, or react. She was just there. She read them books. That same worn book about the bear cub, she read it 3 times in a week. Then she brought others. Sometimes she drew herself, silently, sitting on the floor next to them. Sometimes she just sat and looked out the window with them. David watched from his study through surveillance cameras. Yes, he installed cameras after the 3rd nanny he fired. He wanted to control what happened with the children. I knew about it, though he thought I didn't. In the evenings, he asked me how the boys were, how the new nanny was doing. I answered honestly. No changes, but Sophia wasn't pressuring them, just being present. He nodded, frowned, but didn't fire her. A week passed, then a second. It was a record. And then something happened that changed everything. It was early morning in mid-September. I went upstairs to bring the boys freshly ironed clothes. Passing by their room, I heard a voice. A child's voice. Quiet, slightly hoarse, but absolutely real. I froze. The stack of clothes nearly fell from my hands. The voice came from behind the half-open door. I carefully approached closer, my heart beating so loudly it seemed audible throughout the house. Oliver. It was Oliver. He was speaking. The words were quiet, fragmented, but clear. He was telling Ethan something. Something about their mom, about how she sang to them before bed, how she tickled their feet to make them giggle, how she called them her little owlets because they hated going to sleep. I held my breath and peeked through the crack. The boys sat on the floor between their beds. Oliver had his arm around Ethan's shoulders. Ethan was silent, but his face was turned toward his brother, eyes wide open, full of tears. And Oliver was speaking, whispering, as if afraid that if he spoke louder, the words would disappear again. He said he missed Mom, that he was scared, that he didn't understand why Dad didn't hug them anymore, that maybe it was their fault Mom died. Maybe if they hadn't asked for ice cream on the way home, Dad wouldn't have taken that road. Maybe they were to blame. Ethan shook his head, desperately, fiercely. He wanted to say something. His lips moved, but no sounds came. Only a strangled wheezing escaped his throat, like broken breathing. Oliver hugged his brother tighter. Then he said something that shattered my heart into a million pieces. He said he wouldn't speak aloud anymore, with no one except Ethan, when they were alone. Because if only he could speak and Ethan couldn't, that wasn't fair. They were twins. They always did everything together. If Ethan couldn't speak, then Oliver wouldn't either. So his brother wouldn't feel alone. So he wouldn't think he was broken, and Oliver was normal. They were together, always together. I stepped back from the door. my hand pressed to my mouth to keep a sob from escaping. I made it to the bathroom at the end of the hallway, closed the door, and broke down crying like I hadn't cried since the night of Caroline's death. A 5-year-old child. 5-year-old Oliver took on the burden of silence to protect his brother from loneliness. He sacrificed his voice, his ability to ask for help, his right to healing, so that Ethan wouldn't be alone in his darkness. What monstrous, unbearable love. What strength in such a tiny body. And I understood. Ethan couldn't speak while Oliver was silent. Because if Ethan spoke first, he would betray his brother's sacrifice. And Oliver wouldn't speak while Ethan was silent, because then his sacrifice would lose meaning. They had locked each other in a prison of silence out of love. And no adult in this house saw it, except me. Now, I wiped my tears, washed my face with cold water, looked at my reflection in the mirror. I was 68 years old. I was a housekeeper. But if I didn't do something now, these children would remain in their silence forever. I needed help, and I knew whose. Sophia. I found her downstairs in the kitchen. She was preparing breakfast for the boys. Oatmeal with bananas and honey. Simple food, nothing fancy. I sat across from her at the table. I told her everything about what I heard, about Oliver who spoke secretly, about Ethan who couldn't, about their terrible, beautiful vow of silence. Sophia listened without moving. The spoon froze in her hand over the pot. When I finished, she slowly lowered the spoon and covered her face with her palms. We sat in silence. The oatmeal bubbled on the stove. Birds sang outside the window. And we sat with the weight of this knowledge between us. Finally, Sophia raised her head. Her eyes were red but dry. She asked what I needed from her. I answered that I had no idea. But together we had to figure something out. Sophia nodded. Then she said she needed to understand who these children were before the accident. What they were like when they were happy, what they loved, what they played, what they dreamed about. Because to bring them back to life, she needed to show them what life was like before the pain. And I remembered. I remembered the diary, Caroline's diary. She kept it from the moment the twins were born. I knew about it because I sometimes found her in the evenings, sitting at the small table by the window in her bedroom, writing something and smiling. When I asked what it was, she answered that she was recording their childhood so she wouldn't forget a single second. After her death, David removed almost all her belongings. He gave away clothes, hid jewelry in a safe, threw out cosmetics. He couldn't see reminders of her. It tore him apart. But he didn't touch the room. He closed the door and never went in again. He didn't allow anyone to enter, except me, because someone had to maintain order there. Dust, air it out, change sheets on the bed where no one slept. I knew exactly where the diary was, in a dresser drawer under a stack of scarves. I stood, looked Sophia in the eyes, and told her to wait there. I went upstairs. My heart was pounding. I was breaking David's trust. I would enter his dead wife's room. I would take her personal belongings without permission. But the children were more important. Children are always more important. I opened the door to Caroline's room. The scent of her perfume still hung in the air, faint, ghostly. The room was untouched, as if she had stepped out for a minute and would return any moment. I approached the dresser, opened the drawer. Under the scarves lay a thick notebook in leather binding, dark blue. On the cover, embossed in gold letters, it read, "My boys." I took it, pressed it to my chest. I whispered, "I'm sorry, Caroline. Sorry for taking it without asking. But your children are drowning, and only you can save them." I returned to the kitchen, placed the diary in front of Sophia. She looked at it as if it were a sacred relic. She slowly ran her fingers over the cover. She asked if I was sure we should do this. I nodded. Sophia opened the first page. There was Caroline's handwriting, rounded, soft, with flourishes. The first entry was dated the day the twins were born. "Today I met my sons. Oliver was born first, at 3:47 a.m. He screamed so loud the nurses laughed. Ethan came out 3 minutes later, at 3:50. He didn't cry. He just looked at me with huge eyes, as if asking, 'Mom, what is this world you brought me into?' And I promised them both, 'I will make this world the best place on earth for you.'" Sophia read aloud. I stood nearby, and tears streamed down my cheeks. Caroline was gone, but her love remained. In these words, on these pages, we began reading further. Page after page, Caroline recorded everything. First smiles, first steps. First words, Oliver said mama at 10 months. Ethan said dada at 11. Favorite games. Oliver loved hide and seek. He hid under the blanket and giggled when they found him. Ethan loved building towers from blocks and destroying them with delight. Bedtime rituals. Caroline sang them the same song every evening. A lullaby her own mother had sung to her. Sophia asked if I could hum the melody. I nodded. I closed my eyes and sang quietly in a trembling voice. It was an old American lullaby. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." Caroline had adapted the words in her own way, added the boys' names, turned it into their personal song. Sophia listened carefully. Then she took out her phone and asked me to sing again. And she recorded it. She said she would sing it to the boys. We continued reading. Caroline described their personalities with remarkable precision. Oliver was the brave one, first to climb the slide, first to try new food. But he was afraid of thunderstorms. During storms, he would climb onto his mother's lap and hide his face in her shoulder. Ethan was cautious, observant. He could sit for an hour by the window watching birds. But he was terrified of the dark. Caroline left a nightlight in their room specifically for him. Favorite toys. Oliver had a stuffed giraffe named Jerry. He dragged it everywhere. Ethan had a little blue car that he rolled on all surfaces, making engine sounds. Sophia asked where these toys were now. I didn't know. After the accident, many things were put away. David couldn't look at them, possibly in the storage room on the 3rd floor where boxes of children's things were kept. Sophia closed the diary. She said we needed to find them. The giraffe, the car, everything that reminded them of the time when they were happy. We went up to the 3rd floor. The storage room was piled with boxes. It took an hour to find the right one. It stood in the very corner, under old blankets, as if someone had deliberately wanted to hide it away. Inside were toys. The stuffed giraffe, yellowed, with one eye torn off and sewn back crookedly. The blue car with a scratch on the roof. Blocks, books, a music box with a dancing ballerina, Sophia took out the giraffe and the car. She pressed them to her chest. She sat right on the dusty storage room floor and cried. Quietly, soundlessly, her shoulders shaking. I sat next to her, put my hand on her shoulder. I knew she wasn't crying only for someone else's children. She was crying for her son, for the toys she had given away or thrown out because she couldn't look at them, for the life that had been cut short. We sat like that for several minutes. Then Sophia wiped her face, stood, took the toys, and said it was time to bring the children home. The next morning, Sophia brought the toys to the playroom. She didn't say anything, just placed the giraffe and the car on the floor between the boys and stepped away. Oliver and Ethan sat by the window as usual, looking at the garden. They didn't notice right away. Then Ethan turned his head. He saw the blue car. His whole body tensed. He stared at it as if he'd seen a ghost. Slowly, very slowly, he slid down from the windowsill. He approached. He knelt down. He picked up the car with trembling fingers. Oliver turned around. He saw the giraffe. His eyes widened. He jumped off the windowsill and grabbed the toy. He pressed it to his chest so hard, his knuckles turned white. The boys looked at each other, then at the toys, then at Sophia. She sat in the corner of the room on the floor and smiled. For the first time since she'd arrived, I saw her smile. A real smile, not a polite mask. She said quietly that these were their friends. They had missed them. She had found them and brought them back. Ethan sat on the floor, placed the car in front of him, and he began rolling it slowly in a circle, making a quiet sound, vroom, vroom. Almost inaudible, but it was a sound. The first sound from his throat in 7 months. Oliver sat next to his brother. He placed the giraffe on his lap. He stroked its worn head. Sophia didn't move, didn't approach, just watched. And I saw in her eyes, she understood. She understood this was only the beginning, that the road would be long, but the first step had been taken. That day, the boys didn't let go of the toys. They ate with them, watched TV holding them on their laps. They went to bed embracing the giraffe and the car. David noticed. In the evening, he asked me where the toys came from. I didn't lie. I said Sophia found them in the attic and returned them to the boys. He was silent for a long time. Then he said that meant she was going through their things without permission. I answered that she was saving his children. He needed to choose what was more important. David didn't respond. He turned and went to his study. But he didn't fire Sophia. The next day, she brought something else. The music box with the ballerina. She wound it up and a delicate melody filled the room. Ethan flinched. He ran to the music box. He watched the ballerina spin. And for the first time in 7 months, a smile appeared on his face. Small, uncertain, but real. Oliver approached too. The brothers stood side by side, watching the dancing figure. Their shoulders touched. They held hands. Sophia sat on the floor and began reading from the diary. She read Caroline's entries about how she danced with the boys, spinning them around the living room to this music, how they giggled and asked for more, more, more. The boys listened. They didn't move, but they listened, and something new appeared in their eyes. Memory. A connection to the past that seemed lost. Every day, Sophia brought something new from the diary. A game. A song. A ritual. Caroline wrote that on Sundays they baked cookies together. The boys helped knead the dough and shaped figures. The house smelled of cinnamon and vanilla. Sophia suggested baking cookies. She brought the boys to the kitchen. I helped. We poured out flour, added butter and eggs. We gave each of them a piece of dough. At first, the twins just stood there, looking at the dough in their hands. Then, Ethan slowly began kneading it. His fingers moved uncertainly, as if remembering a forgotten motion. Oliver followed him. They shaped, silently, concentratedly. Ethan made a round figure. Oliver made something like a star. Sophia praised them. She said their mom would be proud of them. When the cookies baked and the smell filled the house, I saw David standing in the kitchen doorway. He watched his sons, sitting at the table, with milk and warm cookies. There were crumbs on their faces. Ethan was licking his fingers. Oliver chewed slowly with his eyes closed. Ordinary children, doing ordinary childhood things. On David's face was an expression I hadn't seen in 7 months. Hope. Fragile, afraid to break, but real. He turned and left before anyone could notice the tears on his cheeks. In the diary, Caroline described an evening ritual. After dinner, they sat in the living room, and she read stories to the boys. Not from books, but her own. Stories improvised on the spot about 2 bear cub brothers who traveled through a magical forest. Sophia asked if I remembered these stories. I shook my head. Caroline never wrote them down. She improvised each time. But the diary had clues. The names of the bear cubs, Ollie and Eddie. Descriptions of their adventures. How they searched for honey. How they saved a lost butterfly. How they befriended a wise owl. Sophia began telling these stories in the evenings. She sat on the floor in the living room. The boys settled nearby, not right next to her, but closer than before, and she led them into the imaginary forest. The first evenings, they just listened, motionless, silent. But on the 5th day, when Sophia told how Ollie was afraid of thunderstorms, Oliver suddenly nodded. Once, barely noticeably. Sophia didn't stop. She continued as if nothing had happened. But I saw, she noticed, and her heart beat faster. On the 8th day, when the story reached the part where Eddie searched in the dark for his nightlight, Ethan pointed to the real nightlight in their room. He pointed with his finger. Sophia smiled. She confirmed, yes, exactly like that one. This was communication. Small, nonverbal, but communication. The children were beginning to return. 3 weeks passed since Sophia's arrival. 3 weeks of toys, stories, cookies, music. 3 weeks of patient, careful return to life. And I noticed a change not only in the children. David began coming out of his study. At first briefly. He stood in doorways, observed. Then he started staying longer. Once he sat in an armchair in the corner of the living room while Sophia told a story. The boys saw him. They froze. Oliver squeezed Ethan's hand tighter, but they didn't run, didn't turn away. David sat quietly, barely breathing, afraid to scare away the moment. After the story, he stood and left without saying anything. But I saw, his hands were trembling. For the first time in 7 months, he had spent more than 10 minutes in one room with his children. And the world didn't collapse. The next evening, he came again, sat in the same armchair. Sophia nodded to him, acknowledging his presence but not emphasizing it. She continued the story. This time, when she finished and the boys got up to go to bed, Oliver turned for a second. He looked at his father. Right in the eyes. David froze. He didn't dare even blink. Oliver turned away and went upstairs, holding Ethan's hand. But the look was there. Contact was made. For the first time since the night of the accident. David remained sitting in the armchair for another hour after the children left. Sophia quietly put away toys. I brought him whiskey, but he didn't touch it. He just sat, staring into emptiness. Finally, he spoke. He asked Sophia how she did it, how she knew what to do. Sophia didn't turn around. She continued folding blocks into a box. She answered simply. She didn't know. She was just trying to return to them what they had lost. Memory of their mother without pain. The feeling that love doesn't die with a person. David asked if it hurt her, working with someone else's children after what happened to her son. Sophia stopped. She was silent for a long time. Then she said it hurt every second, but this was pain that healed, not destroyed. She couldn't bring back her child, but she could help his children, and there was meaning in that. David nodded. He said thank you. He stood and left. I saw him climbing the stairs. Stopping at the nursery door, his hand reached for the handle, froze. He didn't enter, but he stood there for 5 minutes, just listening to them breathe in their sleep. This was progress. 1 month turned into 2. Sophia became part of the house. She came every morning at 8 and left at 6 in the evening. Sometimes she stayed late if the boys asked. Asked not with words, but with looks, touches, the language they had developed. They began moving more, playing more. Ethan rolled his car all over the house. Oliver carried his giraffe everywhere, even on walks. Yes, walks. Sophia started taking them into the garden. First for 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. They played hide and seek among the trees, collected leaves, fed squirrels. They still didn't speak, but they lived, moved, felt, and David watched from his study window. I saw him standing there for hours, looking down, at his sons who were learning to play again, at the woman who had returned their childhood to them. And I saw how he looked at Sophia, not only with gratitude, with something else, deeper. He was falling in love. It was slow, almost imperceptible. But I had worked in this house long enough to recognize such things. David began coming down for breakfast when Sophia arrived. He asked how she slept, if she needed help. He lingered in the kitchen, sipping coffee, finding reasons not to leave. He began showing interest in the details of the day, what they did, what they played, what they read. Sophia answered briefly, professionally. But I saw she sensed the change, and it made her wary. One evening, when the boys were already asleep, David came down to the living room. Sophia was still there, reading the diary, making notes about what to try tomorrow. He sat next to her. He asked if he could read too. Sophia handed him the diary. David opened a random page. He began reading. It was an entry about the twins' birthday, when they turned 2. Caroline described how they blew out candles, how Oliver tried to eat a candle along with the cake, how Ethan got covered in cream from head to toe and laughed. David read, and tears flowed down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them. He just read and cried. Sophia sat next to him silently. She didn't touch him, didn't comfort him with words. She was just there. Sometimes presence is more important than words. When David finished reading, he closed the diary and was silent for a long time. Then he said he envied Sophia. He envied that she knew more about his children than he did, that she remembered Caroline better through these entries than he did through his memories, which were clouded by pain. Sophia answered quietly that he could change, could start over. The children were waiting for him. They weren't lost, just frightened, and they needed a father. David looked at her, long, intently. Then he said what I feared hearing. He said she had saved his family, that without her, they would have been lost forever, that he didn't know how to thank her, that perhaps she could stay, not as a nanny, as part of the family. The air in the room thickened. Sophia didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, and in her eyes I read a whole storm. She stood. She said she needed to go home. It was late. David stood too. He tried to stop her, put his hand on her shoulder. Sophia gently pulled away. She said softly but firmly that she was here for the boys. Only for them. And she left. David remained standing in the living room. I watched from behind the door. On his face was incomprehension, pain, confusion. He had fallen in love with a woman who was returning his former life to him. But this woman wasn't going to become a replacement for his dead wife. The next morning, Sophia came as usual. She behaved professionally, politely, but kept her distance. David tried to start conversations at breakfast, but she answered monosyllabically and quickly left with the boys to the playroom. I understood what was happening. Sophia was afraid that David saw in her not Sophia, but the image of Caroline returned through her actions, that he was in love not with her, but with how she was returning his former family to him. And she was right. A week of strained silence passed between the adults. The boys noticed nothing. They continued playing, listening to stories, eating cookies. Their world grew brighter every day. But between David and Sophia, a wall had grown. Then something happened that changed everything. It was mid-October. The day was overcast, a thunderstorm gathering. Sophia was reading to the boys in the living room when the first clap of thunder rolled over the house. Oliver jumped. His face went pale. He rushed to Sophia, buried his face in her shoulder. Thunderstorm. He had always been afraid of thunderstorms. Sophia hugged him, began quietly humming the lullaby, the same one Caroline used to sing. The second clap of thunder. Ethan also got scared, pressed against his brother and Sophia. Sophia held them both. She sang. She stroked their heads. She whispered that everything was fine. The storm wasn't dangerous. It was just the sky talking to the earth. David stood in the doorway. I don't know how long he'd been there, but he saw. He saw his children embracing this woman. How they trusted her with their fear. How she became their refuge. And something clicked inside him. He entered the room. He sat on the floor next to them, slowly, carefully, afraid to scare them away. Oliver and Ethan didn't pull back. They looked at their father with wide eyes. Thunder struck again. Oliver flinched, and David did what he hadn't done in 7 months. He extended his arms, opened his embrace. Oliver hesitated. He looked at Sophia. She smiled, nodded. She released him to his father. And Oliver slowly, uncertainly crawled into David's arms. David hugged his son so tight, as if afraid he would disappear. His body shook. He cried, his face buried in the boy's hair. Ethan watched. Then he crawled too. He pressed against his father from the other side. For the first time since the night of the accident, David Westbrook held both his sons in his arms. All three cried, quietly, soundlessly, but tears flowed. Sophia stepped back, sat aside. She gave them space, but tears were on her face too. They sat like that until the storm passed, until the sky cleared, until the sun came out. When the boys fell asleep, exhausted by emotions, David carefully carried them upstairs. He laid them in their beds. He kissed each on the forehead. He came back down. Sophia still sat in the living room, looking out the window at the wet garden. David sat across from her. He was silent for a long time. Then he spoke. He apologized for confusing gratitude with feelings, for trying to make her something she wasn't, for seeing in her the return of the past rather than an independent person. He said he understood he wasn't ready for anything except fatherhood, that he needed to learn to be a father before being anything else, that he had fallen in love not with her, but with the image of a restored family she had created. Sophia listened. When he finished, she turned to him. She said she was grateful for his honesty, that she understood he had seen Caroline in her, returned through games, songs, stories. But she wasn't Caroline. She never would be. She had her own pain, her own past, her own path. She came here to heal by helping others, but not to become a replacement for someone. Not a wife, not a mother. Just Sophia, who gave the boys what she knew how to give. David nodded. He asked if she would leave. Sophia was silent. Then she answered no. She would stay as a nanny if he still wanted, but with clear boundaries. Professional ones. She was here for the children, and their relationship would be professional, friendly, but nothing more. David agreed. He extended his hand for a handshake, a new beginning, an honest one. Sophia shook his hand, and I, standing behind the door, understood this was the right ending. Not a fairy tale, not romantic, but honest and healthy. Days passed. David began spending more time with the boys. Sophia guided him, taught him, advised, but stepped back, giving them space to be a family. Father and sons. He read to them from Caroline's diary. He told them about their mother, not with pain, but with love. They looked at photographs together, videos. The boys cried. David cried. But these were tears of healing, not destruction. Oliver began making more sounds. Not words, but sounds. Laughter, sighs, humming when he ate something delicious. Ethan still remained completely silent, but his eyes came alive. He pointed at things, gestured, drew. He communicated. Sophia said this was progress. Voices would return when they were ready. They couldn't be rushed. November turned to December. The first Christmas without Caroline was approaching. David feared this day. But Sophia found entries in the diary about how they celebrated. Caroline described traditions, decorating the tree as a family, baking gingerbread cookies, reading the Christmas story by the fireplace. Sophia suggested repeating it. David hesitated, but agreed. They bought a tree, small, real, with the scent of pine. They brought boxes of ornaments from storage. The boys carefully took out decorations, many of which they remembered. They hung them on branches. David helped. Sophia put on Christmas music. Old songs, classics. When the tree was ready, they sat in front of it. They watched the blinking lights. David hugged the boys. Sophia sat nearby, but not right next to them. She observed. And then a miracle happened. Ethan opened his mouth. A sound came from his throat. Strangled, hoarse, but a sound. Ma. David. Everyone froze. David hugged his son tighter. He whispered, "Yes, son, yes. Mama, your mama." Ethan tried again. The sound was clearer. Mama. Tears poured down the boy's face. He cried and tried to speak at the same time. Mama. Mama. Oliver hugged his brother, and then he spoke too, for the first time in front of adults. His voice trembled but was clear. He said, "They remembered her, Papa. They remembered Mama." David couldn't speak. He held both sons, his body shaking with sobs. Happy. Relieved. Healing. Sophia stood. She quietly left the room. She gave them the moment. A family moment where she didn't belong, and that was right. I found her in the kitchen. She stood by the window, looking into the darkness, crying soundlessly. I approached. I hugged her. This young woman who came to our house with her broken soul and healed someone else's children while healing herself, who sacrificed her heart but maintained boundaries, who was strong enough not to become what they wanted her to be. Sophia leaned against me. She whispered that her son would be proud of her. She knew it. Finally knew it. Christmas passed warmly. Not perfectly, but sincerely. The boys spoke a little, in short phrases. They answered questions. They asked for things with words, not gestures. Ethan spoke more slowly, with difficulty. His voice returned gradually, but it returned. Oliver talked for both of them, compensating for months of silence. He told his father about what they did with Sophia, about Jerry the giraffe, about the car, about the bear cubs Ollie and Eddie. David listened eagerly. Every word was a gift. January brought the real turning point. The boys started kindergarten, a special program for children after trauma. Sophia drove them there in the mornings. The first days were hard. They clung to her, didn't want to let go. But the teacher was patient, experienced. Gradually, the twins began separating, playing with other children, laughing. Sophia wasn't needed all day anymore. Her hours were reduced. She came only in the evenings for a couple of hours. She helped with homework, read before bed. David took on the rest. Breakfasts, walks, games. He was learning to be a father, a real present father. February, 1 year after the accident. David organized a small memorial ceremony. Just family, he, the boys, me, Sophia. They went to the cemetery. The twins placed flowers on their mother's grave. Oliver told her about kindergarten. Ethan whispered that he missed her. David stood holding their hands. He spoke to Caroline. He thanked her for the children. He asked forgiveness for taking so long to be the father they deserved. He promised he would manage now. Sophia stood aside, an observer, not a participant, as it should be. When they returned home, David called Sophia into his study. I was helping the boys with lunch, but could hear. He said he was ready to let her go. Not because he was dissatisfied, but because she had done what she came to do. She had returned voices to the children. She had returned his sons to him. She had taught them all to live again. The boys no longer needed a full-time nanny. They needed a father. And he was ready to be one. Sophia answered that she understood, that she was glad, that this had been her goal. David asked if she would remain a friend to the family, if she would visit them. He didn't want the boys to lose her completely. Sophia agreed. Of course, she would always be nearby if they called. But now this was their family. He needed to build it himself. They shook hands. Two people who had survived loss, who had helped each other survive, who didn't become a couple, but became something no less important. Allies in the war against darkness. Sophia's last working day was at the end of February. She came in the morning as usual, but the atmosphere was different. The boys knew. Children always know. They were quiet, clung to her. Sophia explained calmly that she wasn't disappearing, just that Papa would be with them more now, and she would come to visit on Sundays. They would bake cookies, read stories. She wasn't going anywhere. Oliver asked if she promised. Sophia hugged him. She promised. Ethan was silent but pressed against her with all his might. In the evening, Sophia gathered her things. Not much, she never brought much. David handed her an envelope, a generous bonus, gratitude. Sophia accepted with thanks, but both knew money wasn't important. What mattered was what she was taking from here. Healing. Proof that after loss, you could live. That by helping others, you save yourself. The boys hugged her goodbye, long, tight. Then they let go. They returned to their father, who stood behind them, his hands on their shoulders. Sophia left the house. I walked her to the car. At the door, she turned. She looked at the lit windows, at the silhouettes in the living room, father and two boys. She said quietly that they would be okay. Now they were a family again. I nodded. I hugged her one last time. I asked if she would be okay. Sophia smiled, the first real bright smile I'd seen on her face. She said she would be too. Finally. She got in a car and drove away. I returned to the house. I went upstairs. The boys were getting ready for bed. David was reading to them from Caroline's diary. His voice was steady, warm. Oliver interrupted him. He asked Papa if they didn't need to be afraid anymore. David closed the diary. He looked at both boys. He sat on the edge of the bed between them. He told them honestly that fear doesn't disappear completely. They would always remember Mama. It would always hurt sometimes, but hurting didn't mean broken. They could be sad and happy at the same time. Remember the past and live forward. Ethan asked quietly, uncertainly, if Mama would have wanted them to be happy. Speaking still came to him with difficulty. Every word was an effort. David hugged him. He said more than anything in the world, buddy. She would want to see them laugh, see them grow, see them live. Oliver pressed in from the other side. He said that they would try, Dad. David answered that he would too, son. He would too. They sat like that, embracing, father and sons. Not a perfect family, traumatized, glued together from fragments, but alive, fighting, loving. I quietly closed the door. I went downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. I took out my own notebook, the one where I had been recording events of recent months, and I wrote the final entry. Today, Sophia left, but she left behind something greater than memories. She left healing, proof that even after the darkest night, dawn comes, that love doesn't die with death. It transforms. It lives in stories, in songs, in traditions, in the voices of children who learn to speak again. David no longer hides from his sons. Oliver no longer stays silent out of sacrifice. Ethan is no longer locked in a prison of speechlessness. They are a family, not like they were before, but perhaps stronger, because they survived darkness and emerged. And Sophia? She saved them. And in saving them, she saved herself. She found a way to live with loss, not forgetting her son, but not letting pain define every second of existence. Some stories don't end with a wedding, don't end with romance. They end with healing, boundaries, respect, friendship. And that is no less important an ending. I closed the notebook. I finished my tea. I looked at the calendar on the wall. The first Sunday in March. Sophia would come to bake cookies with the boys. David would help. I would watch from the corner of the kitchen, as always. And life would continue. Not perfectly, not without pain, but it would continue. And that's the only thing that truly matters. Epilogue. A year passed. The twins were 6 years old. They attended regular school. Oliver was loud, sociable, had friends in every class. Ethan was quiet, thoughtful, but he had two best friends who understood that sometimes speaking was hard for him, and that was okay. David reduced his work schedule. He no longer spent nights in his study. He picked the boys up from school himself. He cooked dinner with them. He read before bed, not from Caroline's diary. They had read it all, from first page to last. Now he read new books. But they kept their mother's traditions. Cookies on Sundays, the lullaby before sleep, stories about the bear cubs Ollie and Eddie. Sophia came once a week, sometimes more often if the boys asked. She became part of their lives, but not the center. A friend, not a replacement. An aunt, not a mother. She met someone, a good man, a widower with a daughter. They weren't rushing. They were healing together, slowly building something new. David was happy for her, sincerely, without jealousy, because he finally understood her role in his life hadn't been romantic. It had been the role of a rescuer, a guide from darkness to light. And now each walked their own path, but with gratitude for the journey traveled together. I still worked in the Westbrook house. I was 69. I planned to retire next year. David asked me to stay. He said the house wouldn't be a home without me. I smiled and said we'd see. But the truth was, my mission was complete. I had watched this family die, and I had watched it be reborn. Not from ashes, from love, pain, patience, and the incredible strength of two little boys who held on to each other through the darkest night. Today was Sunday. Sophia would arrive in an hour. David had already gotten out ingredients for cookies. The boys were running through the house, playing bear cubs in the magical forest. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the garden. Spring had come. The first flowers were blooming. Life was returning. And I thought about Caroline, about how she would be proud of her family, proud of her husband who learned to be a father, proud of her sons who turned out stronger than anyone could have imagined. Death stole her from them, but it couldn't steal love. It lived in every song they sang, in every recipe they cooked, in every story they told. Caroline wasn't with them physically, but she never really left. Because love doesn't die, it just changes form. And sometimes When I heard the boys' laughter, I felt like I heard her laughter too. Quiet, content, the whisper of a mother who knew her children would be okay because they had learned the most important things: to speak, to love, to live forward, together. A quiet pause of a mother who knew her children would be okay because they had learned the most important things: to speak, to love, to live forward, together. That is the story about how healing doesn't always come in the form we expect, and that sometimes salvation comes not from those we love, but from those who taught us to love again.